Hello. Hopefully people will find it here on YouTube. I don't know what to say. I'm going insane. Has nothing to do with the fact that we had a later schedule today, but Facebook would just not let the stream forward unexplained. Kept saying error, access token. I have no idea what it means. We do the exact same process every day, and sometimes YouTube or Facebook just changes their I don't know what, and I'm not able to break through on Facebook. So I hope that people will find the class today over here on YouTube. I can see that we are live on YouTube. There was a different YouTube stream that I started first that is obviously not carrying this feed. Nina, if you get a chance, see if you can just, edit that video and remove it. The YouTube that is not going live. Or just leave it. Don't worry about it. Hopefully people will get it over here. Shalom from the Bronx. Chaim in Florida. Ella's in the house, and I truly hope that other people will make their way over here to YouTube. I did put the notice up on the Facebook page saying that we are live on YouTube, and Facebook is just a disaster today. I do not know why. Okay, well, Hashem didn't want us to stream on Facebook today. That's what we're going to say. Okay, everybody, my apologies. I just don't know what to say. It's not user error. I mean, I just do the same exact process every day. And sometimes it works on Facebook and sometimes it doesn't. We really have to end this dependence on Facebook. But it's YouTube, actually, that streams to the AT app. And I hope everybody has the AT app. Get the AT app, and then you can watch it through YouTube. YouTube overall is more reliable. We have a much bigger audience on Facebook, but YouTube seems to be more reliable. That's Shandora in the Bronx with a different name. Good to see you over here. And I truly hope people will find it soon. Okay, so we have a very interesting page. Let's definitely get our thinking caps on. Not easy material, but I think it's quite rewarding material as we piece it together, exactly what we're talking about here. So our daf is page 95 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 8. Okay, so we're talking about the differences in the liabilities and exemptions and responsibilities of the unpaid bailee, the paid bailee, the renter, and the borrower, sort of in order of escalating liability. The unpaid bailee is only going to be liable for loss if he is negligent or if he falsely swears that the item was stolen and then he's caught in that lie, he'll have to pay double. The paid bailee and the renter are going to be liable for cases of theft and loss, but when it comes to things beyond, circumstances beyond their control, they can swear an oath that that's what happened, and then they are not liable. And the renter and the paid bailee have the same level of responsibility. And then the borrower has to pay in every case. And then yesterday, are we actually on Mishna number 2? It's Mishna number 1, right? Mishna number 1. And then yesterday we also learned this particular exception to these laws, that if, even in the case of a borrower who has the highest degree of responsibility for that which he borrows if the owner of the item that he's borrowing from actually comes along with the item. So for example, he's borrowing an ox to plow his field, and the owner of the ox comes with the ox and is either working with him or is just present. And then the ox has an accident and dies, or something like that. And we're going to talk about today what about theft and loss and when the owner is present. But then even the borrower would be exempt. And this is because the Torah specifically says that if the owner of the deposit, the owner of the animal or whatever item is being borrowed, comes along with it, then even the borrower is exempt. We picked this up on page 95a, right near the top. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive the liability of a borrower in a case of theft or loss, right? So basically, we know that the borrower has the highest degree of responsibility and liability, so much so that even for cases that are beyond his control, circumstances beyond his control, he is liable and has to replace what he borrowed. So how much more for theft and loss, which is supposed to be something that could have been avoided, and that's why the paid bailee and the renter are liable for theft and loss. But now the borrower, why do we have to derive that? Because it's not said explicitly in the Torah. So how do we know that the borrower is liable for theft and loss? Says the Gemara, and if you would say, let us derive it from the fact that a borrower is liable if the animal entrusted to him was injured or died, that circumstance is beyond his control, because theft and loss is similar to injury and death, in that they are cases of accidents. Well, this derivation can be refuted. What is notable about a case where the animal was injured or died? It is notable in that it is no longer possible to make an effort and bring the animal back to its undamaged state. And so it is reasonable that the borrower is liable in such occurrences. But will you say this ruling about a case of theft or loss, where it is still possible to make an effort to locate and bring back the animal, right? If it's thought stolen or lost, it can be found or it can be recovered. The animal still exists, as opposed to where it's injured or dies, where the animal, especially if it's severely injured or if it's dead, obviously cannot be brought back to the owner the way that it was. So this is a difference between theft and loss versus accident or death. So rather, the borrower's liability for theft and loss is derived like that which is taught in a baraisa. From the verse, and it is injured or dies, in Exodus 22:13, I have derived only that a borrower is liable if the animal is injured or dies. From where do I derive that he is liable in a case of theft or loss? You can say it is a kal v'chomer inference. If a paid bailee who is exempt from liability in a case in which the animal is injured or dies is nevertheless liable in a case of theft or loss, then with regard to a borrower who is liable in a case in which the animal is injured or dies, isn't it logical that he should also be liable in a case of theft or loss? And this is a kal v'chomer inference that has no refutation. It's so solid, you cannot refute it, right? Let's just say it again. How do I know that the borrower is liable for theft or loss? Because in the baraisa, it says that the verse, injured or dies, right, is about that he's definitely, that the borrower is liable if it is injured or it dies. How do I know about theft or loss? It's a kal v'chomer from the case of the paid bailee. The paid bailee is exempt from liability in a case when the animal is injured or dies, but he is nevertheless liable in a case of theft or loss. Well, then with regard to a borrower who is liable in a case when the animal is injured or dies, isn't it logical that he should also be liable for theft or loss? Boom, that's a winning argument, says the Gemara. You cannot refute it. So right away the Gemara asks, what is added by the conclusion of the baraisa that this kal v'chomer inference has no refutation. Normally we just make the kal v'chomer inference. Why does the Gemara say that this particular kal v'chomer has no refutation? So the Gemara explains that the Baraisa anticipated the following rebuttal and dismissed it before it could go anywhere, right? The rebuttal would be, and if you would say about the kal v'chomer inference that it can be refuted as follows, what is notable about the case of a paid bailee? He is notable in that he pays the double payment when he takes a false oath stating the claim that the deposit was taken by an armed bandit. If he lies, and he said it was taken by an armed bandit, which would excuse him, but then he's caught in the lie, he has to make a double payment. And is that the case of the borrower? No, because the borrower doesn't swear to that if it was taken by an armed bandit, because he's liable even if it was taken by an armed bandit. Now, if so, you can derive a law from the case of a paid bailee to that of a borrower who pays only the principal in such a case. It would appear that a borrower does not always bear a more severe level of liability, and the kal v'chomer inference would thereby be undermined. But anticipating this refutation, our Baraisa states that it is invalid. Because even so, the fact that a borrower is liable to pay the principal when he claims a deposit was taken by an armed bandit and he doesn't have the ability to exempt himself by taking an oath, this is not a leniency. He's not less liable or less accountable than the paid bailee, but rather this is a greater stringency than the fact that a paid bailee is liable for the double payment, but only if he takes a false oath to that effect, right? It's a greater stringency because he's liable automatically if an armed bandit takes it. The paid bailee would not be liable in the case of an armed bandit unless he lied that an armed bandit took it. But when you introduce a lie into it, and then he has to pay a double payment, well, that's not any reason to say that he has a greater degree of accountability than the borrower. He doesn't, right? He's only liable to that double payment if he lies. Short of telling a lie, he for sure has a lower degree of responsibility. Consequently, a borrower has a more severe level of liability, and the kal v'chomer inference is valid, and therefore it is irrefutable, and that's why it was stated that it is irrefutable. Now, alternatively, if you wish, say that the Baraisa holds that an armed bandit is classified as a robber. So, what's a thief? Is somebody who comes in surreptitiously and you didn't know he was there. What's a robber? A robber is somebody who steals from you in front of you brazenly. And an armed bandit is a robber who does it, with threat of violence, which is a little bit different than the robber. So, if you wish, say that the Baraisa holds that an armed bandit is a type of robber, so the paid bailee is not liable for the double payment if he claims that the deposit was taken by an armed bandit, as the double payment is paid only for a false claim of theft, not robbery. Consequently, the basis of the refutation is flawed. Okay, so the Gemara asks, we have found sources for the liability of a borrower in a case of theft or loss. From where do we derive a source for the law that in a case of theft or loss, he is exempt if he had also borrowed the services of the owner at the same time as borrowing the animal? So we've already said that you're borrowing an ox to plow your field. So if anything happens to that ox, like it dies on the job, you're liable. Unless the owner of the ox came with the ox at the time that you borrowed the ox. And then the Torah specifically exempts even the borrower from having to pay because the owner of the ox was with the ox. Okay, so that is in case of injury or death. What about theft or loss? Are we going to say that a borrower who has borrowed an ox and while it was in his possession, it was stolen or he lost it, is going to be exempt in the same way as if it died or was injured, as long as in the cases where the owner of the ox comes along with it? Do we extend the exemption of the owner being with the ox from injury and death extended also to theft and loss? That's what's being asked. as borrowing the animal. The verse describing the exemption from liability is stated only with regard to a case in which the animal entrusted to him is injured or dies. So can we extend that exemption to cases of theft or loss? And if you would say, let us derive it from the fact that a borrower who also borrowed the services of the owner is exempt if the animal is injured or dies, as the type of occurrence should not make any difference, well, then one can counter what is notable about, right? If you're saying, well, injury or death is the same as theft or loss, so why wouldn't we extend the principle that if the owner came along with the animal, even the borrower is exempt for both injury and death and theft or loss? Why not? Well, what is notable about a case in which it is the animal is injured or dies? It is notable in that it is an unavoidable accident, meaning circumstances beyond his control. And so it is reasonable that one's liability is limited. Can you say the same in a case of theft or loss, which theoretically he could have prevented, right? Theft or loss is closer to negligence than injury or death. So maybe since it's closer to negligence, we should say that even if the owner of the animal came along with the animal, still the borrower should be liable. So rather derive the law that a borrower who also borrowed the services of the owner, right? The owner came with the animal, is exempt if the animal is injured or dies from the law of a paid bailee, who is exempt for theft and loss if he had borrowed the services of the owner at the same time as the animal. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that the exemption from liability also applies to a paid bailee? I thought we were talking about the exemption of a borrower when the owner of the animal comes with it. Why are we talking about a paid bailee now? Well, we derive the limitation of liability of a paid bailee from the limitation of liability of a borrower. So just as below, with regard to a borrower, for those cases in which the verse states that he is liable, it states that if he borrowed the animal together with the services of the owner, that he is exempt. And so too, here, with regard to a paid bailee, for those cases in which he is liable, if he undertook to safeguard the animal together with borrowing the services of the owner, then he is exempt. So the Gemara asks, through what method is this derived? So again, just to take a 30,000 foot view for a second and remember what we're doing. We have the four cases that have three laws, right? The unpaid bailee, the paid bailee, and renter who have the same law, and the borrower, right? And we have cases involving injury or death of the animal, theft or loss of the animal, armed bandits, etc. And then we have the exemption that comes if the owner of the animal travels with the animal while it's being used by the borrower, or perhaps the paid bailee, or the unpaid bailee, or the renter, etc. Okay, so what happens is that we have the four different types of person who's taking care of somebody else's property. We have the different kinds of loss. And now we've introduced this exemption. But the exemption that's mentioned in the Torah hasn't been applied to all the different types of custodians. And the different kinds of loss aren't mentioned in all the different kinds of custodian. Right? So that's why we're needing to, carefully, the sages need to carefully analyze which types of loss are going to extend from one kind of custodian to another, which kinds of exemption are going to extend from one custodian to another, right? And because because every type of loss and every type of custodian is not mentioned in every type of law, the sages need to extend laws out from one kind of case to another, from one kind of custodian to another, from one kind of exemption to another. Okay. Okay, so where am I? Okay, so we derive the limitation of liability of a paid bailee from the limitation of liability of a borrower. So just as below, with regard to a borrower, for those cases in which the verse states that he is liable, it states that if he borrowed the animal together with its owner, that he is exempt. So too here, with regard to the paid bailee, for those cases in which he is liable, if he undertook this to safeguard the animal together with its own, bringing its owner along with it, then he would be exempt. And the Gemara asks, through what method is this derived? If it is derived through an interpretive principle known as what do we find, i.e. a comparison between cases with similar details, well, the use of this method can be refuted. Just as we refuted the possibility of deriving a limitation on one's liability in a case of theft or loss from a case in which the animal was injured or died. Because a case in which it is injured or dies is an unavoidable accident, it is reasonable that one's liability be limited specifically to such circumstances. So rather, the law that a bailee who also borrowed the services of the owner, right? The owner came with the deposited item. That the fact that this bailee is exempt if the animal is stolen or lost, we derive this as follows. The verse states, and if he borrows, and that's Exodus 22:13. So the conjunctive and, from and if he borrows, indicates that the passage detailing the liability of a borrower is adding to the first matter, i.e. it should be seen as a continuation of the previous passage detailing the liability of a paid bailee. And therefore, let the case of a paid bailee above be derived from the case below of the borrower. Above and below meaning as it's found in the Torah. First it talks about the unpaid bailee, then the paid bailee, then the renter, then the borrower. And let the case of the paid bailee above be derived from the case below of the borrower, including the exemption from liability in a case where the owner came along with the borrowed animal. So the Gemara immediately raises a difficulty. But still, the laws of a borrower cannot be derived from those of a paid bailee through a kal v'chomer inference, as any attempt to do so could be refuted like this. What is notable about the case of a paid bailee? It is notable in that he is exempt in a case in which the animal is injured or dies due to circumstances beyond his control. The paid bailee is only supposed to be liable for theft or loss, or if he's negligent. Shall you also say the same for a borrower who is liable in a case in which the animal is injured or dies due to circumstances beyond his control? Since the borrower has a more severe level of liability, perhaps the exemption from liability that exists in a case of theft or loss for a paid bailee does not get extended to the case of a borrower. So rather, the law that a borrower who also borrowed the services of the owner is exempt if the animal is injured or dies could be derived in a different way, like this. From where did we originally derive the liability of a borrower in a case of theft or loss? It was derived through the kal v'chomer inference from the fact that a paid bailee is liable. Once the principles of a kal v'chomer inference so we said that if the paid bailee, who has a lower level of responsibility, is nevertheless liable for theft or loss, then obviously the borrower, who has a higher degree of responsibility, of course he would be liable for theft or loss. So that's the kal v'chomer. And one of the principles of a kal v'chomer inference is that it is sufficient for the conclusion that emerges from the kal v'chomer inference to be like its source. In other words, a law derived by means of a kal v'chomer inference is no more stringent than the source from which it is derived. Accordingly, just as in a case of theft or loss of a deposit entrusted to a paid bailee who undertook to look after it at the same time as borrowing the services of its owner, meaning the owner of the animal came with it, in that case the bailee is exempt, so too, in a case of theft or loss of a deposit entrusted with a borrower who had borrowed it together with the services of the owner came with the animal, the borrower would also be exempt. Right? The Torah said the borrower is exempt if the animal is injured or dies when the owner came with it. And now we've derived theft or loss, even the borrower would be exempt if the owner came with it. Now the Gemara asks, okay, well this works out well according to the one who accepts the principle of it is sufficient. But according to the one who does not accept that principle, then what can be said? How do we derive the borrower's exemption from liability in a case in which he borrowed an item and the owner came with the item and then it was lost or stolen? So rather, says the Gemara, it could be derived like this. The verse states, and if he borrows, and the conjunction and indicates that the passage detailing the liability of a borrower is adding to the first matter, i.e. the laws of a paid bailee. And therefore, let the case of a paid bailee above be derived from the case below of the borrower. And the laws applying to the case below of a borrower can be derived from the case above of a paid bailee. In other words, we're basically extending the same principles back and forth in order to get that if the owner comes along with the item, both the borrower and the paid bailee are going to be exempt, and that's going to work for injury and death and theft or loss. Now, an Amorite dispute was stated with regard to a mishap that occurred due to a borrower's negligence. Okay, so now we're moving past the owner of the ox coming along with the ox when the ox was being used either by the paid bailee or by the borrower. Now we're talking about something different. Now we're talking about negligence. So, with regard to a mishap that occurred due to a borrower's negligence. Now, negligence. Even the unpaid bailee is going to be liable if the animal, was lost because he was negligent with it. The paid bailee and the renter obviously are going to be liable if they were negligent, because they don't even have to show negligence. If it was lost or stolen from their care, they're liable. The borrower is always liable. Unavoidable circumstance, injury, death, theft, loss, whatever, the borrower is always liable. What difference does it make if he was negligent? He has to pay even if he wasn't negligent. Why are we raising negligence? Because what we're asking now is, but if the owner of the animal came along with it, which exempts the borrower from liability for injury, death, or even theft or loss, because the owner is with the animal at that time, but does that exemption apply if the borrower is also negligent? So with regard to a mishap that occurs due to a borrower's negligence in safeguarding the deposit that he borrowed together with the services of the animal's owner, right? The owner came with it. So about this, Rav Acha and Ravina disagree. One sage says he is liable, like he would be always liable. Doesn't matter that now the owner came with the animal because this guy was negligent. And the other sage says he is exempt because the exemption, even for a borrower, when the owner of the animal comes with it, is an exemption, right? It's a written exemption in the Torah. Therefore, if the owner of the animal came with it, then even if the borrower was negligent, he's still going to be exempt. So these are the two views. One says he's liable, one says he's not. If he's also negligent, proven to be negligent, but the owner of the animal came with it. So the one who says that he is liable holds that the verse beginning, and if he borrows, which details the exemption from liability when one borrows an item together with its owner, is expounded in connection with the passage preceding it, i.e., that of a paid bailee, but not in connection with the passage preceding the one preceding it, i.e., that of an unpaid bailee. Again, we have to borrow law from other types of custodians to see what's going to happen here with the borrower. So accordingly, the verse, if its owner is with him, he does not pay, which appears in the passage of the borrower, that is not written in reference to an unpaid bailee. So that exemption from liability does not apply to him. And in addition, the liability of negligence, which appears in the passage of the unpaid bailee, is not written in reference to a paid bailee or to a borrower. Accordingly, the liability of a paid bailee and of a borrower in a case of negligent is derived only via a kal v'chomer inference from the liability of an unpaid bailee, but not from an explicit verse. But it is not possible to derive that even a paid bailee and a borrower are exempt in cases when they took hold of an item together with borrowing the services of its owner, and a mishap occurred due to their negligence. And what is the reason for this? When it is written, if its owner is with him, he does not pay, that is in reference only to a borrower and to a paid bailee. Even then, it is written in reference to only those liabilities that are written explicitly with regard to them. It is not written with regard to their liability for negligence, which is derived only through the kal v'chomer inference. Consequently, the borrower and the paid bailee are liable for negligence, even in a case where they also borrowed the services of its owner. Conversely, the one who says that the borrower is exempt, even if he was negligent, so long as the owner of the animal came along with the animal, the one who argues this holds that the verse, and if he borrows, which details the exemption from liability in a case where one borrows an item together with its owner, is expounded in connection with the passage preceding it, meaning the paid bailee, and also in connection with the passage preceding the one preceding it, i.e. that of the unpaid bailee. And accordingly, when it is written, if its owner is with him, he does not pay, this exemption is written also in reference to an unpaid bailee, limiting his liability even if he is negligent. So the Gemara suggests proofs for each opinion. We learned in the Mishna, and just to get the picture, right? So I have a field and I need to plow it, okay? So I ask my neighbor, can I borrow his ox? So my neighbor says, listen, I only have one ox. I see that you are in great need. If you don't plow your field, you're not going to be able to plant. You're not going to be able to feed your family. I understand you need to borrow my ox, but I have to make sure that nothing happens to my ox. So I'm going to come along with you and supervise you plowing with my ox. So now, if the ox dies, you can see why the borrower would be exempt, because the owner was supervising it and making sure that whatever was happening with the ox is according to the standards that the owner wants. In other words, the ox is basically still in possession of the owner. It really hasn't transferred into the possession of the borrower. So that's why the exemption exists. Now we're adding this idea that the borrower is also negligent in that situation. So I'm going to, hook up this ox to my plow. And I was negligent in the way that I secured the plow, or I was negligent in marking the field, or, I did something stupid. And because it's my land and my plow, and, I'm the one who's familiar here, and the owner of the ox isn't so familiar. So even though he came along with the ox, I was negligent in some way that caused damage to the ox. Right, so you can see why, the exemption of the owner being with the ox is always going to protect the borrower, okay, because the owner is with the ox. But on the other hand, now we add this extra negligence, so maybe the borrower should not receive the benefit of that exemption, right? These are the two sides of the argument, and now we kind of get it a little bit more, the picture, how it's working. Okay. Okay. So now the proofs for each opinion. So we learned in the Mishnah that in the case of one who borrowed a cow and its owner with it, or one who borrowed a cow and he hired its owner with it, right? Either I'm borrowing both, I'm borrowing the ox and I'm borrowing, right? In other words, the owner's going to come with it, I'm not paying him. Or I'm borrowing the cow and I'm paying the owner to come with it. Or if one borrowed the services of the owner and hired him and afterward borrowed the cow. So in all these cases, if the cow died, the borrower is exempt, right? So it's very important, we established this yesterday, that at the time of borrowing the cow, the owner has to already be coming with the cow. Where the borrower is not going to get that exemption at all is if he first borrows the cow and is using the cow on his own, and then later the owner comes and is present with the cow at the time that the cow dies. There, the borrower does not get the benefit of the exemption because there was some time where he was using the cow unsupervised by its owner. If something then happens to the cow, even when the owner is present, the borrower will be liable. That's what we established yesterday. So in all these cases, if the cow died, the borrower is exempt as long as the owner came along with the cow at the time that the cow was being rented. So the Gemara now explains how this is a proof when we introduce the concept of negligence. So the Mishna mentions the exemption from liability with regard to a borrower, whereas it does not teach it with regard to an unpaid bailee, who is liable only for a mishap that was the result of his negligence. Presumably, this is because exemption from liability does not apply to a mishap that is a result of the bailee's negligence. But the Gemara rejects this proof. But even according to your reasoning, does it teach exemption from liability with regard to a paid bailee? It does not, although it certainly applies to at least cases of theft and loss. So rather, with regard to the Tan of the Mishnah, the matter that is explicitly written in the Torah, with regard to the Tan of the Mishnah, the matter that is explicitly written in the Torah, he teaches. And those matters that are derived through interpretation, he does not teach. Consequently, no proof can be brought from the Mishnah. The fact that something is there or not there is not going to be dispositive because there might be a different reason why he didn't teach something. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a proof from a baraisa. If one borrowed an animal and borrowed its owner with it, or he rented an animal and hired its owner with it, or he borrowed the animal and hired the owner with it, or he rented the animal and borrowed the owner with it. In all these cases, although the owner performed the work for him in another place, i.e. not even near the animal, and the animal dies, the borrower or the renter is exempt, right? So it doesn't matter that the owner is specifically supervising the work, as long as he is nearby, working on the property of the borrower at the same time that his animal is there. The exemption from the usual borrower's liability does apply, and the borrower is exempt if the animal is injured or dies and presumably is stolen or lost. Now the Gemara notes, the scholars in the study hall assume that this baraisa is in accordance with whose opinion? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that one who rents an item is responsible for it like a paid bailee. According to this understanding, the Baraisa teaches that the exemption from liability applies to both a borrower and a paid bailee, like a renter. Consequently, the Baraisa can serve as a proof. Doesn't this Tana teach even a matter that is derived through interpretation, i.e. the fact that exemption from liability applies to a paid bailee, while he still does not teach that it applies to an unpaid bailee? It would appear that this is a proof that exemption from liability does not apply to an unpaid bailee, since it does not apply to a mishap that is the result of the bailee's negligence. Now, the Gemara immediately refutes this proof, as one could counter, in accordance with whose opinion is this baraisa? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that the liability of one who rents an item is like that of an unpaid bailee. That's not the law, but that's what Rabbi Meir says. And according to his understanding, the Baraisa teaches that the exemption from liability applies to an unpaid bailee, and it is understood that the same is true for a paid bailee. Understood like this, the Baraisa explicitly applies the exemption from liability to a case of negligence. Since, ultimately, it is unclear, according to whose opinion the Baraisa is taught, no proof can be drawn from it. So we don't have a proof yet. And if you wish, say that the Baraisa can be understood as referring to an unpaid bailee, even if it is assumed to be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as Rabba bar Abba reversed their opinions and taught, how does one who rents an item pay in the case of a mishap? Rabbi Meir says like a paid bailee, Rabbi Yehuda says like an unpaid bailee. Okay, we still haven't derived, or we haven't proven that, we don't know the answer yet, that that a borrower who would normally be exempt from liability if the animal, let's say, dies, because the owner of the animal came along with it, either he was hired or he was borrowed, but he came with it. But now we add negligence on the part of the borrower. So does his exemption still apply? We don't know yet. So Rav Hamnuna says that the exemption from liability when one borrows an item together with the services of its owner exists only in a very specific circumstance. A borrower is always liable unless the item entrusted to him is a cow and its owner plows with it in the service of the owner, or it is a donkey and its owner drives it by walking behind it in the service of the borrower, i.e. the owner and his animal are engaged in the same work. Now, this is not the law. The law is that if the owner is present, like even on the same property, that exemption from liability is going to apply. But Rav Hamnuna is saying, no, come on, what are you talking about? The borrower is always liable, and the only reason we're going to say that he's not liable if the owner came along with the animal is if the owner is working with the animal and the borrower at the time that the mishap happens to the animal. That's what Rav Hamnuna says. And even so, the borrower will not be exempt unless the owner is working for him from the time of the borrowing of the animal until the time when it is injured or dies. Right? That is the principle we've already established, that the owner has to come along with the animal from the very first moment that the animal is borrowed. And the Gemara notes, so evidently Rav Hamnuna holds that the phrase, its owner is with him, teaches that the exemption from liability applies only when the owner is working for the borrower for the entire matter. For the entire time, yes, or at least from the time that the animal was borrowed. And Rav Hamnuna would also say, and working on this with the animal. Rava raises an objection from the Baraisa cited previously. If one borrowed an animal and borrowed the services of its owner with it, or he rented the animal and hired its owner with it, or he rented the animal and borrowed the owner with it, or he borrowed the animal and hired the owner with it, in all these cases, although the owner performed the work for him in another place, i.e. he wasn't working near the animal, and the animal died, the borrower or renter is exempt, right? Is exempt. So in other words, as long as the owner came along with the animal, even if the owner is not in the same part of the field where the animal is working, the borrower or renter would be exempt. Rava explains how the Baraisa poses a challenge to Rav Hamnuna. And what? Is it not referring to a case where the owner was engaged with different work than his animal? And the Baraisa proves that the exemption from liability applies even in such a case. But the Gemara rejects this for now, and says, no, the Baraisa is referring to a case where the owner was engaged with the same work as the animal. And the Gemara then says, but if so, what does the Baraisa mean by saying he performed the work in another place? And the Gemara answers, well, for example, it is a case where the owner loosens the hard soil with a hoe while walking ahead of the animal. He is engaged in the same work, but not in exactly the same place. And the Gemara says, but from the fact that the latter clause of the Baraisa is referring to a case where the owner was working alongside the animal, it may be inferred that the first clause, i.e. the passage of the Baraisa cited above, is referring to a case where the owner was engaged with different work. As the latter clause teaches, if he borrowed it and afterward borrowed the services of its owner, or he rented it and afterward hired its owner with it, in both these cases, even though the owner was plowing alongside it at the time that it died, the borrower or the renter is liable, right? That's the law from yesterday. That if he borrowed or rented the animal first and then later brought the owner to participate in the work, then even if the owner was working directly with the animal and supervising it, the borrower or renter is going to be liable if something happens to the animal because there was a period where he had the animal without the services of the owner, without the supervision of the owner, without the partnership in work of the owner wasn't present. And because there was such a period, even though the animal, nothing happened to it during that period, the mishap happened later, nevertheless, because that period existed, now the borrower and the renter does not get the benefit of that exemption from liability that he gets when the owner is coming along with the animal, because the owner didn't come along with the animal at the beginning, he only came later. Now, in resolution of this difficulty, the sages say, both the first clause and the latter clause pertain to a case where the owner was engaged with the same work as the animal. And the difference in formulation of the two clauses is because the first clause teaches us a novelty, and the latter clause teaches us a novelty. The first clause teaches us the novelty that although the owner was not actually working alongside his animal, but was merely engaged with the same work, since the owner was working for the borrower at the time of the borrowing, the borrower is exempt. And the latter clause teaches us the novelty that although the owner was actually working alongside his animal, since the owner was not working for the borrower at the time of the borrowing, when the animal first came, the borrower is liable. Now the Gemara asks, what is this? Granted, if you say that the first clause is referring to a case where the owner is engaged in different work than his animal, and the latter clause is referring to a case where he is engaged in the same work as his animal, then this is the novelty of mentioning what type of work he did. It teaches that it is irrelevant whether the owner did or did not work together with his animal. Rather, the liability of the borrower depends on whether or not the owner was working for the borrower when he entrusted the borrower with his animal. As long as he's working for the borrower somewhere on the borrower's property, then the exemption applies, even if the owner is not with the animal that the borrower is using. But if you say that the first clause and the latter clause both pertain to a case where the owner is engaged in the same work as his animal, then what is the novelty of mentioning what type of work he did? Both this clause and that clause concern similar cases in which the owner is engaged in the same work as his animal. It is therefore apparent that the clauses concern different cases. The first clause teaches that the borrower is exempt even in a case where the owner is engaged in different work than his animal. And the first part of Rav Hamnuna's ruling, that the owner needs to be engaged in the same work as his animal, is refuted. That's why the law is, as long as the owner came along with his animal, then whether the owner is directly supervising or just somewhere else on the property, if the animal now has a mishap while in the possession of the borrower is exempt because the owner came with the animal, so long as the owner came with the animal from the beginning. And furthermore, even the second part of Rav Hamnuna's ruling that the exemption applies only when, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Even the second part of Rav Hamnuna's ruling that the exemption applies only when the owner was working for the borrower from the time of the borrowing of the animal until the time of the mishap can be refuted, as it is taught in a baraisa from the implication of that which is stated, if its owner is with him, he does not pay. Do I not already know what is stated in the next verse? That if its owner is not with him, he shall pay? Rather, what is the meaning when the verse states its owner is not with him? It serves to tell you if he was with him, i.e. working for him at the time of borrowing, he does not need to be with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies for the exemption from liability to apply. But if he was with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies, he does not need to have been with him at the time of borrowing for the exemption from liability to apply. And it is taught in another baraisa from the implication of that which is stated, if its owner is not with him, he shall pay. Do I not already know that what is stated in the preceding verse, that if its owner is with him, he does not pay? So rather, what is the meaning when the verse states, if its owner is with him? It serves to tell you, once the animal has left the domain of the lender, meaning the owner, and has been entrusted to the borrower, with its owner working for the borrower at the same time, even for only one moment, that it came at the beginning, the owner and the animal came together at the beginning, then if the animal dies, the borrower is exempt. And the Gemara concludes the refutation of the opinion of Rav Hamnuna, provided by these baraisas, is indeed a conclusive refutation. And we will stop there. Okay. I am so sorry that we were not able to broadcast on Facebook today. We'll download this video and upload it to Facebook later. I don't know why. It's just the problem is, our streaming software and Facebook, sometimes it just doesn't work together because Facebook keeps changing its requirements, and then our streaming software has to update and catch up with it, and so sometimes there's these days. So please, this is why we stream on both Facebook and YouTube, right? So I think it's better that I only wrestle with it up to a certain amount, and then we just go forward on one of the platforms. So if on one day when I'm scheduled to go, I'm not going, where I will always post what's going on, give you the message. Like today, it's a coincidence that on the day that we were going later, we also had a Facebook problem. But I posted both that the schedule would be 90 minutes late today at 7:30 Pacific, and then when we couldn't get online on Facebook, I put in a new note that we're having technical problems on Facebook and we are over on YouTube. So I'm just saying this by way of, if you think I should be live and I'm not, check the Facebook page to see if there's a notice there of accidental Talmudist. And then, come over to YouTube, or if you normally come on YouTube and it's not on YouTube, see if there's a notice over there on the Facebook page. It's the best we can do. But now that we've got the app, it does seem that generally speaking, YouTube almost always works. And it's YouTube that streams to the app. And now we're also getting it worked out where the app will notify you when the stream starts. So definitely get the AT app. It is available for both iPhone and Google, so Android phones. And that's a good way to follow. But if you're on desktop, you rather just do it from your computer. Okay, so, again, YouTube works. And I know a greater number of people like to use Facebook. So, Facebook works 99.9% of the time. It's just these awful days when I go insane trying to get it going. I'm sorry for all that long-winded explanation. Okay, let me just see if there's any comments or questions that I should take. Makes me insane. Okay, so looks like it's not a comment. Okay, great. No notice on Facebook, said Bill, but it was there, right? Did you not see the? Not at 6 o'clock, but the 7:30 delay, I did have that up before 6, and I mentioned it yesterday in class and put that up before the 6 o'clock start. The technical difficulty that went up about 10 minutes later after I tried so hard to make it work and couldn't. Sorry. Okay. Bill, it's really that Facebook's comments section feels more intuitive, at least for me. Yeah, I agree. I think the comments section in Facebook works a little bit better. So for the discussions, Facebook is better. And God willing, by tomorrow, we'll have this worked out and, we'll be back to normal. I don't know what happened today or why. The push notification from Facebook. Got you. I got you. Yeah, that's something different. I'm just saying that when I can't get on, I'll just make a little post, an individual post saying I wasn't able to get on. Yeah, the push notifications, I don't know about that. That's Facebook's thing. If you're normally getting those and then you don't get it, it's worth going to Facebook and just, looking at the pull-down menu on Accent Talmudist, because just from time to time, they change what you get notifications for and what you don't. I think it's because Facebook is always changing its algorithms in order to drive people to places where somehow Facebook makes more money. So what can I say? It's an imperfect tool, but we do the best we can. God willing, tomorrow back to normal. Have a great night.